Okay. Now, I was asked by somebody on my channel to document something on how this happened. How in the world could this happen? How in the world could a person who's a Canucks and Bruins fan become a fan of the team known as Chicago? Now, for this, I'm wearing my Atlanta jersey because irony is ironic. But it's a good question. So I'm looking back to the 2010-11 book here. Let's run down the list here. Brian Bickle, I was not a fan. David Boland, not a fan. Kane, I wasn't a fan of Kane at the time. I'm a fan of Kane now. I hated Boland, not a fan of Bickle. Blue Line, I wasn't a fan of John Scott. And then guys who were already gone when this book came out were Andrew Ladd and Dustin Byfuglien. I didn't like them either. My point is the players that are in Chicago right now playing for the team, I don't dislike as much as the ones who played for them back in 2010 and 2011. I am a big fan of, well, let's see which ones I'm a fan of at this point. I would qualify myself, well, I mean, Brouwer I'm a fan of now. He's not that team anymore. Hossa, I don't have anything against Hossa. He moved around to get a Stanley Cup, and some people hated him at the time for it. He was mocked because he went to Pittsburgh and lost in the final, and then he decided to go to Detroit, and they lost to Pittsburgh in the final the year after. And then he went to Chicago the year after that, and the idea was Chicago will get to the final and he'll lose again, but that's not what happened. But I don't have anything against Hossa. Kane, big fan of Kane at this point in time in his career. Sharp's on the team at this point. I don't have a problem with Sharp. I'm not a huge fan of his, though. He's in Dallas now, and I'm not a big fan of him. He's not very consistent. Taves, Taves is a warrior. I really have nothing against Taves at all. They have Leddy on the prospects here. I liked Leddy a lot. Leddy is the same as Boychuk. The Islanders stole him for cheap. And, yeah, big steal for the Islanders there. Brandon Peary shows up on their list. And then their prospects, or their draft picks that year. Kevin Hayes. But in terms of beyond the personnel, the reason that I started cheering for Chicago, and that came in last year's playoffs, really fully came in last year's playoffs, is the heart. The heart, the determination. A team that I had perceived as kind of taking shortcuts and the easy road in 2010 evolved that by the time 2015 rolled around that I viewed them more as a solid, athletic, and fair team. Like I didn't see them cheating their way past anybody. And I always got that feeling with Detroit in the 90s and early 2000s, and I kind of got that feeling with Chicago early on in this decade. But honestly, Chicago was just so effective and so smart, never panicked. Quenneville, I love Quenneville as a coach. I think he's the best coach in hockey. I know Babcock gets that distinction for some, but to me it's Quenneville. It's easy to say, well, yeah, he's a good coach, but if he didn't have that great team. Yeah, we used to say that about Scotty Bowman too, but there's a reason that the great teams were hiring Scotty Bowman, because he knew how to get them over the top. And there's really no debating the fact that a guy wins the Stanley Cup as the coach, he did something right. And I really have full respect for Quenneville. And then there's the fact that they knock out California teams here and there, and that kind of endears me to them. And yeah, I'm honestly, I was torn on it as the playoffs continued last year because I am a Canucks fan and I do have sort of this thing where if you regularly eliminate my favorite team, I'm probably not going to like you. That's why California teams are at the bottom of my favorites list, and Montreal sits in there with them because Montreal has a history of knocking out Boston, and the California teams have a history of ending Vancouver seasons early. So, well, not as much San Jose, but they did the last time they met them. So they're on that list too. And that's really what it comes down to. But Chicago, it's their heart, it's their drive. And it didn't show up this year as much against St. Louis, but I honestly think that was St. Louis and Troy Brouwer willing themselves past the Blackhawks. I think that was a team, much like Vancouver back in 2011, that said, no, we've had enough of losing to the Blackhawks. We have to reverse this. We have to write a different story. We can't do this again. And full respect to them for what they were able to accomplish. I am in a position now where maybe it's because I've gotten older, but that whole I hate this team, I don't really get that as much as I used to. Maybe that's why I'm able to have this channel that's expanded to the point that it has, because it is hard for me to hate on a team because there's always going to be players on any team, including a team I hate. There's going to be players that I say, man, but I like that guy. Even in Anaheim, as much as I can't stand the Ducks, there are players on the Ducks that I genuinely cheer for. They signed Mason Raymond. My first thought is, I hope he comes to camp in full health, fully motivated, and he steals a job on the third line. Somehow, some way, maybe somebody gets hurt, paves the way for him. I hope he does really well. And that's, just I have a soft spot for Raymond. I didn't mind when Vancouver got rid of him, but I still cheer for the guy. I don't have a problem with John Gibson, their goaltender. I'm not a big fan of Bernier, but Bernier's just there as expansion fodder, really. He's not there for anything else. Apparently, and this is one of those regulations I hadn't read off, if a guy's an unrestricted free agent, um, he's not eligible for expansion. That is killer. In other words, if it's June 23rd and I'm going to be a free agent July 1st and the expansion draft's on the 23rd, I can't be a part of the expansion draft. So, players that the current NHL teams want to expose to be drafted, they have to make sure they have a year left on their deal. And they can't have a no movement clause either, or they have to protect them. This is going to be a rough year. It's a very interesting thing. I didn't even know that was in there. I read that on the Canucks forum today, and I'm like, oh, okay. That changes everything, because there's a lot of contracts expiring at the end of next year. So, the Ducks would have to sit down with Bernier and hash out a 1-year contract with him. Or else they have to protect him and expose Gibson, I guess. Or find somebody else who wants to negotiate a 1-year deal with Bernier and find a way to trade him off. And then you have to take a goaltender back that you can expose. Like, this could be rough for certain teams. This could be a really, really rough time. I now fully understand why GMs are panicking, because the NHL is making it as difficult as possible for teams to do what they used to do, which was expose players they just didn't want. And now they're going to have to expose players that they'd rather keep. And it is going to be a rough, rough situation. The thing that interests me is there's 30 teams. There's 23 roster spots in an NHL team. So Vegas is going to get 30 players. I mean, not all of them are going to be NHL talent, but I find that odd because the guys who are going to be exposed are going to be pretty good. So they're going to have not only the pick of some pretty good players, but they're going to be able to trade like 5 and not lose anything off their opening night roster. I think we'll be able to get draft picks back, prospects back. This is a stacked system in favor of Vegas. the Nordiques should be kicking themselves for not getting into this, because it's potentially huge. So yeah, that's the whole Chicago thing, though. Like it's hard to explain. I'm watching a hockey game, and based on who's on the ice and my personal feelings towards a team aside, if a player plays the way that a Patrick Kane or Jonathan Toews plays, it's really hard for me to cheer against them. And in their case, it was both. I really found myself, and Kane this year became one of my favorite players. Patrick Kane absolutely this year became one of my favorite players. I think he's fantastic. To have all of this personal drama hanging over his head and to still win an Art Ross trophy, that's pretty damned amazing. And he went on a huge game point streak in the middle of all of this drama hanging over his head and potential legal battles, and he just rose above it. I never looked at what was going on and thought he was guilty anyways. I thought something just didn't add up because I didn't think he was that stupid. Now, people are going to bring up the cab driver incident. That's a drunken mistake. The incident they were talking about, this is, something completely different. Completely different. So, I do believe that he might be an arrogant prick off the ice, but I don't think he's a criminal arrogant prick. And what he does on the ice is pretty damned amazing, and he has every right to be arrogant off the ice based on what he does on it. Because when he's on his game, he's the best player in the league. Between the two, I would still take Sidney Crosby. If I was starting a team next year and it was just for that season, Crosby. Now, if it was for the next 5 or 6 years, it's Kane. Absolutely Kane. He is a dominant player, and Corey Crawford doesn't get the respect that he deserves as a back or as a I was going to say as a backup, as their goaltender. He really doesn't. And Duncan Keith is an absolute warrior. He's a dirty player. He pisses me off a lot, but he does bust his ass. And Seabrook's won me over too with his play, and even Hjalmarsson. And I really didn't think anything of Hjalmarsson's game. I remember when San Jose put in that offer sheet and then Chicago matched it, and I thought, is Chicago that crazy? Like, he's not worth $4.5 million a year, but I'll be damned. Here we are years later, and Hjalmarsson's still with the team, so apparently he is worth $4.5 million a year. So I guess we'll see. Um, it's 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 going to be an interesting season coming up, and it'll be interesting to see if I'm still cheering for Chicago at this time next year. If Vancouver does manage to make some noise, and Canucks fans seem to be optimistic that they could, be interesting to see if they're able to get to the point where they're against a Chicago. Let's say they get a wild card spot and they end up playing Chicago, and then we'll see if I'm still emotionally neutral at that point or not. I'm thinking probably not. But for now, I'm honestly still a Hawks fan, and it is really hard for me to say it. But I was a Hawks fan back in the 80s, right up until 95 when they knocked the Canucks out of the playoffs. 95. Because Vancouver beat St. Louis, and then it was Chicago knocked them out, and then in 96 it was Colorado that knocked Vancouver out. Because Vancouver was in a free fall at that point. And then 97 they missed the playoffs. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it was 95, and it was a guy named Chris Chelios that turned me against Chicago, and yeah. Anyways, those days are gone. And you never know who we'll be cheering for tomorrow, other than Vancouver, Boston, and Dallas in that order. Thanks for watching.